Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something pretty interesting. We're taking Mark Carney's big book,
Yeah, the
Valueless.
better world for all.
Exactly. And we're comparing his vision, his ideas, with what actually happened in the first 100 days of Donald Trump's second term back in, well, early 2025.
It's a fascinating contrast, isn't it? Two really, really different ways of looking at how economies and maybe even societies should work.
Definitely. So you've got Carney on one side, former central banker, UN climate envoy. His book is like a major critique.
It really is. He argues modern economies get too hung up on market price, maybe losing sight of fundamental human values, fairness, sustainability, resilience, things like that. He looks at crises 2008, COVID, climate through that lens.
Right, this idea of a values deficit, and then bam, you have Trump's return, America First, very much influenced by that Project 2025 blueprint we heard so much about.
And those huge global tariffs, plus a real whirlwind of executive orders right out of the gate, a very different approach.
So our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to sort of unpack these two visions. How did Trump's early 2025 moves line up, or maybe more often, not line up with Carney's ideas?
And we want to look at, how effective each approach might be potentially for tackling the big stuff.
Hmm.
Climate change, financial stability, inequality. And we're grounding this all in what actually happened based on reports from those first 100 days.
Okay, let's start with Carney's value then. He kicks off with this distinction between objective and subjective value. I thought that was a really core concept.
Absolutely. Chapters 1 and 2 lay this out. Objective value historically was sort of inherent worth tied to the resources the labor needed. Think classical economics, maybe?
A fair day's work for a fair day's pay, that kind of thing.
Kind of, yeah. But then subjective value became dominant. That's value determined by, well, what someone's willing to pay in the market. Demand, preferences. It boils down to price.
And Carney's big worry, it seems, is that we've gone too far down that road. We equate price with value, full stop.
Exactly. And in doing so, we risk undervaluing things that are crucial but hard to price, like trust, community spirit, a healthy planet. He brings up that Oscar Wilde quote, doesn't he?
Yeah, knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing, it's a pretty stark warning.
It is, because if price is the only metric, these non-market values just get sidelined in decisions, which leads him into money itself and trust.
Right, chapter 3. Money isn't just coins and notes, he argues. It's fundamentally about trust, belief.
Yeah, the word credit itself, from Latin credere, to believe. He connects that to the rise of cryptocurrencies, too.
Suggesting there may be partly a reaction, people losing some faith in the traditional systems.
Possibly. But while he acknowledges the innovation, he's also pretty clear-eyed about their current limits, especially for the general public. Scalability, ease of use, they're not quite there yet for widespread adoption, in his view.
Interesting. Then he introduces this concept of a Magna Carta of money in chapter 4. What's that about?
It's an analogy. Just like the Magna Carta set down basic rights and rules for governance, he argues we need a similar social contract for finance. We need rules, institutions that reflect our shared values, justice, fairness, accountability.
He links it to history too, right? How economic crises often lead to demands for more oversight.
Precisely. The idea is you need public trust for a stable financial system. People need to believe it's working fairly and responsibly, which naturally flows into his discussion about the future of money.
Chapter 5. He sees potential in fintech, digital payments, making things smoother, maybe more inclusive.
Yes, definitely sees the upsides there, reducing friction, bringing more people into the financial system. But he hammers home that point again. The core values, trust, and stability have to underpin it all.
So technology is a tool, but it needs to serve those fundamental principles. It's not just tech for tech's sake.
Not at all. And he again points out the scalability issue for most cryptocurrencies serving the public interest. Then in Chapter 6, the market society, he brings in Karl Polanyi.
The idea that we didn't just have market economies, we became market societies, where market logic creeps into everything.
Exactly. Carney agrees with Polanyi's critique. This dominance of market thinking, he argues, can actually override our moral compass. It can lead to bad outcomes like trashing the environment or widening inequality because the pure market doesn't inherently value those things without rules and guidance.
And it challenges the assumption that the market is always rational, always right.
Right. Which, as you said, tees up his analysis of the 2008 financial crisis perfectly. He was right in the thick of it.
Yeah, his insider perspective must be quite something. What's his take?
Well, he describes finance becoming dangerously disconnected from its purpose, serving people, serving the real economy. It became about complex instruments, about credit itself. He blames, and this is a quote, twisted economics and an amoral culture within finance, plus weaknesses in the institutions meant to watch over it.
And the missing values he points to are things like responsibility, prudence, basic honesty.
Those are key ones, yes. A failure of responsibility for the system as a whole, a lack of prudence, maybe a deficit in honesty. And from that diagnosis, he moves to solutions in Chapter 8.
Reforming finance. How does he suggest we do that?
He talks about smarter regulation, not just more, but better targeted, more transparency, thinking in terms of systems, how actions ripple outwards, and rejecting what he calls the three lies of finance.
Does he think the post-2008 reforms worked?
He acknowledges progress, definitely, but he also flags new risks emerging, things like illiquid assets becoming more widespread, the growth of shadow banking outside the main regulatory net.
So technical fixes aren't the whole answer.
No, his big point is the need for a culture shift, a return to a sense of moral purpose in finance. It needs to serve the public good, fundamentally.
Which brings us to the COVID-19 crisis in Chapter 9, another major test of values.
A huge one.
Yeah.
It forced societies everywhere to make really explicit, really difficult trade-offs between lives and livelihoods, essentially.
Yeah.
Putting a price on things we normally wouldn't.
And he noticed differences in how countries handled it.
Yeah, he observes that places with more transparent, trustworthy governance tended to manage the initial pandemic waves better. And he stresses how crucial solidarity and equity were or should have been, protecting the vulnerable, sharing resources.
But it also exposed and worsened existing inequalities, didn't it?
Absolutely. It really threw those into sharp relief. And societal values became front and center in all the policy debates about lockdowns, support measures, vaccine rollouts, everything.
So looking forward from COVID, in Chapter 10, he talks about recovery. What's his vision there?
He uses that phrase, build back better. But for him, it means consciously embedding values, solidarity, fairness, resilience into the recovery itself.
Not just going back to how things were or just chasing GDP growth.
Exactly. Prioritizing human development, long-term dynamism, societal well-being over just the short-term economic numbers. He even floats the idea of a potential renaissance if we could harness that collective action we saw during the pandemic for other big challenges.
That's quite optimistic, applying pandemic lessons elsewhere.
It is. And that leads him directly to the biggest challenge of all, arguably, climate change, in Chapter 11.
And here he sees the ultimate disconnect, right, between market prices and real existential value.
Totally. He lays out the science, the consequences of warming very clearly, the human impact, the urgency.
He emphasizes that we need to, have emissions every decade to hit net zero by 2050?
That's the path he outlines, based on the science, to try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And he asks that really pointed question. We give huge market caps to tech companies, but how do we value something like the Amazon rainforest, which is arguably essential for planetary survival?
It's a powerful point. So how do we bridge that gap? What's his take in Chapter 12, Breaking the Climate Horizon?
He believes the financial sector can be part of the solution, but it needs guidance. Values, yes, but also clear rules. Things like effective carbon pricing, mandatory climate risk disclosures for companies, getting institutions to make credible net zero commitments.
So it's not about throwing out capitalism, but transforming it.
That's his argument. Transform it from within. Instill a moral duty that goes beyond the balance sheet. He sees it as needing both innovation, green tech, etc., and smart regulation. A balance.
Then he zooms in, chapters 13 through 15, on values at different levels, individual, corporate, financial.
Right. Chapter 13 is about personal commitment. He lists core values like solidarity, fairness, dynamism, sustainability, responsibility, resilience, humility, arguing that our individual values shape the institutions we build.
And for corporations,
he champions stakeholder capitalism, looking beyond just shareholders to consider employees, customers, communities, the environment. Purpose before profit, essentially. Businesses need to be part of solving global problems, not just contributing to them.
And finally, embedding values in finance itself.
Yeah, through things like ESG investing, environmental, social governance factors, developing better metrics that capture long-term societal value, not just quarterly returns. He acknowledges the skepticism around ESG, but argues it's vital for sustainable prosperity.
So, summing up Carney, it's a major challenge to free market fundamentalism, connecting crises to a lack of values, calling for deep change.
That's a good way to put it. Reorienting markets to serve shared human goals. An intellectual broadside, really.
Okay, powerful stuff. Now let's pivot. The first 100 days of Donald Trump's second term in 2025. What stood out immediately was how closely his actions mirrored Project 2025.
That was striking, wasn't it? Reports suggested something like 37 out of 47 early executive actions directly matched recommendations from that conservative blueprint, a very deliberate, rapid implementation.
Let's break it down. Government restructuring, social policies. What were the big moves?
Well, there was the executive order starting the process to dismantle the Department of Education. Staff cuts began. Programs were flagged for shifting elsewhere. A long-term conservative goal put into action quickly.
And the elimination of DEI programs? Diversity, equity, inclusion?
Swift and across the board in the federal government. The order cited concerns about discrimination, and we saw practical effects like terminology changing on websites, rules being rescinded.
Then there was Schedule F. Remind us what that was again.
That was the reclassification of potentially tens of thousands of federal civil service jobs, removing some of their employment protections, making them easier to hire and fire based on perceived loyalty or alignment with the administration's goals.
A big shift away from the traditional idea of a nonpartisan civil service.
Potentially, yes. And alongside that, we saw dismissals of some inspectors general, members of independent commissions, testing the boundaries of presidential power over the executive branch, aligning with that unitary executive theory.
What about public broadcasting? NPR, PBS?
There was an investigation launched into their funding, led by FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, questioning if they served the public interest, followed by an executive order aiming to cut all federal funding. PBS warned it would have a huge impact, especially on smaller stations.
And the social policy changes, often termed anti-woke.
Yes. Reinstating the ban on transgender individuals in the military, reversing the Biden policy. An order prohibiting federal funds for gender-affirming care for minors. HHS directives withdrawing previous guidance. These faced immediate court challenges, of course.
We also saw reversals of some COVID policies, didn't we?
That's right, notably reinstating military service members who'd been discharged for refusing the COVID-19 vaccine and offering them back pay. So, yeah, a very active first 100 days on domestic and social policy fronts.
And immigration, that was always a key focus. What happened there?
A significant ramping up. An executive order deployed active-duty military troops to the southern border, aiming to seal the borders, a more direct military role than we'd seen previously, aligning with Project 2025.
And refugees.
An executive order suspended the entire U.S. refugee admissions program indefinitely, a complete freeze.
What about TPS, temporary protected status?
Moves were made to end TPS for several countries, including Haiti and Venezuela. This potentially impacted hundreds of thousands of people, though again there were legal fights. I believe a judge blocked the termination for Venezuelans, at least temporarily.
And asylum rules. Legal immigration?
Internal directives aimed to bring back policies like remain in Mexico, expand expedited removal processes. There were reports of plans to challenge birthright citizenship using older laws like the Alien Enemies Act, and working with Congress to cut legal immigration numbers and the diversity lottery.
So tighter controls across the board, enforcement surges too.
Yes, orders to increase deportations. And that controversial idea was floated, potentially denying FEMA disaster funds to sanctuary states or cities as leverage.
Wow. Okay, let's shift to economics and trade. Project 2025 had a lot to say here too, right? Starting with spending and regulation.
It did. One of the first things was creating this new body, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. And an OMB memo came out freezing certain federal programs, aiming to impound funds, basically, not spend money Congress had appropriated.
Did that work?
It caused widespread confusion, according to reports. Legal challenges popped up pretty quickly. The administration eventually rescinded the blanket freeze, but maintained they could pause spending on a case-by-case basis, very much in line with what Russ Vought had advocated in Project 2025.
What about taxes and deregulation?
A tax cut proposal was drafted early on. The 2-for-1 rule for regulations was reinstated for every new rule. 2 old ones had to go, and this time it explicitly included guidance documents, not just formal regulations. And a lot of Biden-era environmental and labor rules were delayed or targeted for rollback.
Wasn't Elon Musk involved in identifying regulations somehow?
There were reports he was advising the administration on rules to cut, yes. Interestingly, though, despite all the talk of cuts, initial figures suggested federal spending actually went up in those first 100 days.
Huh. Okay, but the big economic story was trade, wasn't it? The global tariff strategy.
Absolutely massive. The April 2nd announcement really shook things up. A baseline minimum tariff of 10% on all imports. and potentially much higher tariffs, up to 50% or more, on goods from countries with big trade surpluses with the U.S.
This reciprocal trade idea, a complete overhaul.
Completely. The 10% baseline took effect quickly, though there were some initial exemptions for things like oil, pharmaceutical, semiconductors. Then the reciprocal surcharges hit dozens of trading partners: the EU, China, Canada, Mexico, UK, Australia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, even Israel. A huge list.
Did NAFTA's MCA partners get any break?
There was reportedly a partial waiver tied to compliance, but they were still hit. Trump framed it as Liberation Day for American industry.
And the rationale, what was the thinking behind such a drastic move?
Reviving U.S. manufacturing, bringing jobs back home. The administration, heavily influenced by figures like Peter Navarro and the Project 2025 plan, viewed trade deficits as inherently bad, like the U.S. was losing. The tariffs were seen as a way to force concessions from other countries.
How did the world react?
Not well. Global markets plunged. The S&P 500 had a record one-day loss, didn't it? Condemnation came from allies and rivals alike. China immediately announced retaliatory tariffs and threatened export curbs on critical materials.
What about Europe, the UK?
The EU started planning its retaliation. The UK government vowed to shelter British business. Israel sent a high-level delegation, deeply concerned. Warnings of a full-blown global trade war were everywhere.
And domestically, here in the US?
Mixed bag. Sectors like steel and aluminum welcomed it, naturally. But industries relying on imports, retailers, consumer groups, they were alarmed. Predictions of price hikes on everyday goods like eggs started surfacing immediately. People saw their 401ks take a hit.
How did Trump respond to the backlash?
Defiantly, mostly through social media, sticking to the America First message. By the 100-day mark, there were some offers of 90-day tariff suspensions for negotiations, but the damage was arguably done.
So the average tariff rate shot up?
To the highest level in over a century, reports said. The Fed, the OECD, other forecasters, they all downgraded U.S. and global growth projections. Congress was split, predictably.
Okay, one more big area, climate and international engagement. What happened there?
Day one, withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. Again, no surprise, but still significant. And it was part of a broader purge of climate policies across the government. Power plant rules, fuel efficiency standards, methane regulations.
All aligning with Project 2025's stance on climate.
Directly. Met with global criticism, naturally, and warnings from environmental groups about the consequences.
And the reports about targeting NOAA's climate research.
Yes, an internal memo surfaced detailing plans to dismantle key climate research offices within NOAA. Proposed budget cuts of around 25%, eliminating the main atmospheric research office.
Why? What was the justification?
Project 2025 viewed some federal climate science as politicized and unnecessary. But current and former officials raised alarms, saying it could cripple climate monitoring and even degrade weather forecasting accuracy.
What about global health, the WHO?
Formal withdrawal from the World Health Organization, also on day one. Justifications focused on cost, influence, and past criticisms of the WHO's pandemic response. Health experts warned this would increase risks for everyone from future pandemics. Again, very much aligned with Project 2025 skepticism.
And disaster relief. Shifting responsibility to states.
An order was issued to revamp FEMA aid. A council was set up to recommend how to transfer more responsibility and costs to state governments. The policy declared states should bear more of the burden, and some federal funds were reportedly denied. This raised concerns for states prone to major disasters.
Also a Project 2025 theme, right? Using aid for policy compliance.
That leverage idea was definitely part of their thinking. And finally, foreign aid itself took a massive hit. An executive action abolished U.S. EIA, the main foreign aid agency. Projects were terminated or shifted to the State Department with budget cuts. The rationale was waste, ineffectiveness, and putting America first. Development experts warned it would undermine U.S. influence and global stability. Multilateral aid commitments were also under review, with funds frozen to some international bodies.
So, looking back at those 100 days, it really was a rapid-fire implementation of that Project 2025 agenda. Some called it extraordinary destruction of prior norms.
It was certainly a period of dramatic and very swift change across many policy areas.
Okay, now for the core comparison. Let's put these actions side by side with Carney's values vision, starting with climate change and sustainability.
The contrast couldn't be starker, really. Carney: urgent action needed, embed environmental values in markets, global cooperation is key, sustainability is fundamental.
Trump's actions: rollbacks, withdrawal from Paris, clearly prioritizing short-term economic activity over climate stability, effectively devaluing the climate in policy terms.
Right. In terms of effectiveness for actually addressing climate change, Carney's approach is aligned with the scientific consensus. Trump's early actions look counterproductive, potentially making the problem worse, faster.
What about equality and social inclusion?
Carney emphasizes fairness, solidarity, seeing diversity as a strength. His stakeholder capitalism idea aims for broader benefit. ESG considers social impacts.
Trump's first 100 days. America First, a focus on cultural conservatism, rejecting inclusive language, eliminating DEI, the military ban, LGBTQ plus restrictions. It seems to emphasize uniformity over diversity.
Yeah, it's a real departure from Carney's values framework there. Trump's approach risks creating a society, or at least a government, that explicitly values some groups over others, which directly contradicts Carney's call for fairness for all.
Okay, market governance, financial stability, Carney's focus.
Reintegrating ethics, smarter regulation, transparency, global coordination, responsibility, integrity, making markets serve society.
Trump's actions, deregulation push, the unilateral tariff shock creating instability, moves that could undermine independent institutions like the Fed or civil service, potentially eroding integrity and increasing risk.
It really looks like Carney's vision is aimed at preventing instability, building resilience, whereas Trump's early actions, particularly the tariffs, introduce significant instability and heightened economic risk, at least in the short term.
Finally, global cooperation and inequality, Carney's vision.
Global solidarity is central. Working through international bodies like the WHO, aiding developing nations, trying to reduce inequality both within and between countries, valuing global public goods.
Trump's actions. Nationalism, pulling back from international agreements and organizations, slashing foreign aid, the America First trade policy, a general dismissal of global equity concerns.
So again, a huge divergence. Carney's approach seems far more likely to mitigate global inequality. Trump's inward-looking stance could easily widen those global divides further.
So if we boil it down, Carney sees market fundamentalism, the lack of values, as a root cause of crises. Success should be measured by quality of life, equality, sustainability.
While Trump's first 100 days prioritized American power, a specific conservative ideology, and values like national autonomy, maybe even might.
And effectiveness. Short term, we saw market shocks from the tariffs. Long term, on climate, stability, inequality, Carney's vision seems more aligned with sustainable solutions.
It certainly appears that way. There's that stark disconnect. We talked about value as market price versus values as human principles. Trump's actions seem to widen that gap, while Carney is desperately trying to bring them back together.
It really feels like Carney is arguing that policy grounded in those broader human values is actually the path to real long-term prosperity, whereas focusing only on short-term national wins can end up undermining broader societal goals.
Exactly. It's a powerful contrast in leadership philosophies and their potential outcomes. Carney's framework offers one vision for building a better world, and Trump's early second-term actions pointed in a very, very different direction.
So after this deep dive into Trump's first 100 days in 2025 and Carney's values, which vision do you think is gaining ground? And maybe more importantly, what are the implications of that for Canada, for America, for the world?
It's a huge question.
Yeah.
The path taken in those first 100 days certainly represented a major break from the kind of global cooperation and focus on long-term sustainability that Carney advocates.
We'd genuinely love to hear what you think about this clash of visions. Let us know your thoughts. And if there are other topics, other sources you think deserve a deep dive, especially around these big, complex issues, please do suggest them.
Yeah, absolutely. We really value your input.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.